We've been talking a lot about security and how to handle passwords and user authentication and logins, but everything you've done so far in designing your LMS database has specifically left out anything related to passwords. So the tables you just made in project phase 2 didn't have passwords and didn't even have password hashes. So how then do we actually handle all of this stuff? Salting passwords, hashing them, and where do we save them? Well, the way this is typically done is with two different databases. So there's the LMS database, which has information about relationships between the entities in the LMS. So classes, professors, assignments, grades, things like that. Then there's a separate database, LMS users, which has just information about logging in and accounts. So there is some connection between these two databases because students are users, professors are users, but these have a specific meaning and they have specific different relationships with other entities in the LMS tables. In the LMS users tables, this users table only has UID and password hash. It actually has quite a few other things in that, but related to the LMS, it doesn't know really what a student is. It doesn't really know what classes they're enrolled in. It doesn't know any of their grades or anything like that. The only connection between these two things are UIDs. So the way this will work is when a person signs up and creates a new account, you will write the code that goes through the students, the professors, the administrators, finds a new unique UID for them, adds them to the appropriate table with their first name and last name and whatever department they work in, things like that. Then the .NET web server system will automatically take the UID that you produced and it will go over and add a row to the users table. And it will take the password they typed in and salt it, hash it, and then save it there. The LMS users database also has extra other tables tracking things like when did they try to log in and how many times, things like that. And configuration properties such as when logging in do we require two-factor authentication, etc. So it's important to understand the separation between these two databases. One of them is created and managed by you. So the LMS, you made all of those tables manually. You will be writing controllers and link queries that update and query those tables. The LMS users table is managed by the .NET web server system. There's already source code given to us, libraries that just automatically handle all of this stuff, like the KDF, login attempts, and everything. The only thing you need to remember is that the link between these two things is UIDs. But you will be creating UIDs, and then the other system provided for you will be determining whether somebody has successfully tried to log in. This LMS users database, so how do we create this? How do we make these tables? The users table, the login attempts table, how do we know what columns to put in there and everything? And turns out we actually don't need to do that. It's done automatically with a tool. So let's take a look at how that will work quickly. Here's Visual Studio. My code window is we're not looking at the code, so it's tiny and it doesn't matter. What I'm looking at here is the package manager console. So this is the same place where you have done your scaffolding. So you typed some command in here that pointed some scaffolding tool to a database and then automatically created C# classes. So this is essentially just a shell where you can run commands. Well, there's another command we can run that runs a tool that's kind of like the opposite of a scaffolder, where we give it some configuration files, and then it goes and creates tables in a database. So kind of the other way around. the configuration files we give it are things like what kinds of users can we have? Do we want two-factor authentication? What's the minimum password length? Things like that. I won't actually run the command, and won't even really show it. I'll just give it to you in the assignment instructions. You can just go and run that command, and it'll create the tables for you. So let's take a look at those two databases that sit side by side, the LMS database and the LMS users database. So I'm here in LMS 2. The 2 is just for, it's like my sandbox LMS. I don't want to mess with the main one, but it has exactly the same schemas. So let's do show tables. So these are very similar, hopefully, to the tables you created in Project Phase 2. So just tracking courses, classes, departments, professors, things like that. Let's do select star from professors. So in our tables, a professor has a UID, first name, last name, date of birth, and a department that they work in. These are all concerns of the LMS. The login system doesn't care what their first name is, doesn't care what department they work in. All it cares about is their UID. So the login system will have some of these same UIDs from the professors table. Let's now look at the other database. So use LMS users 2. And again, the 2 is just my sandbox version, but it has exactly the same schemas as the real version. So let's show tables in here. So a bunch of kind of oddly named tables: ASP.NET role claims, ASP.NET roles, ASP.NET users. So ASP.NET, that's just ASP.NET. So these tables were automatically created by the command that I ran in the PowerShell from Visual Studio. Let's look at one of them. Let's do describe on ASP.NET users. So lots of things in here, and again, I didn't create any of this, it's all automatic. ID is just a primary key identifier, not really a human readable thing. Username is the actual username that they use to log in. So that is the UID. So let's select username from ASP.NET users. And it's just a bunch of UIDs. So that is essentially the information that these two databases have in common, is just UIDs. This table doesn't know what department this user works in. This table doesn't know if they're enrolled in any classes, or it doesn't even know what a class is. It's just login information. So let's look at some of these other fields. Email, has the email been confirmed or not, things like that. We're actually going to disable a lot of these features. So notice that the email is allowed to be null. We're not going to use email addresses in our LMS. We'll just use UIDs. And then here is the password hash. So as we talked about in the previous lecture, the users table just stores user information and password hashes right alongside each other. And they don't even try to hide the name of this column. So if an attacker stole this table, they would know right where to look to try to find information about passwords. But as we discussed, since the password is salted and hashed, there's not much they can do about it. So there's no need to even try to hide what that is. Here's a couple other things while we're looking at this table. So like two-factor enabled, no. Lockout enabled, no. We're going to turn down a lot of the security knobs just for the purposes of testing and grading. It would be quite difficult to do grading if, like, we had to do two-factor authentication every time we try to log in to your LMS when we're grading it. In a real system, you would obviously want to turn the security knob up. Okay, so let's take a look at password hash. Let's select those out of that table. Okay, there they are, a whole bunch of password hashes for a whole bunch of different users. We'll kind of break this down a little bit. Notice kind of in the middle here and towards the end, they're all different. Every one of these hashes is different, even though these simple users that I've created just to make it easy, I've actually given them all the same password. And they all have different hashes because they all have different random salts. Here's something interesting, though. You might notice that this first 15 characters or so are all the same for every user. And that's because this is not actually part of the hash or the password or the salt or anything. This is just encoded meta information about how this system handles logins. So this is information about like what version of .NET we're using, what hash function it uses, and it doesn't really try to hide that information. It looks kind of like it's encrypted or something. It is encoded, but that's just to make it more compact. There's documentation on how to decode this information, and so anyone can go and look at this and just say, okay, they're using whatever version of .NET, so you can then figure out what hash function was used. And trying to hide which hash function was used is not really helpful because, again, the security comes from the fact that they are salted and that the hash function is one way. Even if you know what it's doing, you cannot find the password given the hash of the password. Okay, and then so let's go back and look at these columns in this table. So that's the password hash. Where is the password salt? As we discussed in the previous lecture, you also have to store the salt somewhere. And they don't actually make a separate column for it. They just store it right alongside the password. So some number of these next few characters is the salt. I don't know if it's exactly that many, but so those are the salts for all of these, and then the rest would be the hashes for all of those. And it's just, there's no need to actually store it in a separate column since it's all just kind of string information. Okay. So to kind of wrap up and recap, the main point that you need to take home from this is there is a users database that will be automatically generated and managed for you, and then there is your database that you will manage and have already generated. You've generated these tables. The thing to keep in mind is that the common link between them is UIDs. So professors have UIDs, students do, administrators do, and this system saves UIDs. So you will give these UIDs to some function. You'll write a controller that will generate a new UID, give the UID and the password to some function that will then go and generate these hashes and will then be used to determine if they've successfully logged in or not. Once they've successfully logged in, you'll do all of your stuff in your own LMS table where, say, after they log in, it should load the home page. So if they logged in as a professor, it'll go find all of the classes that that professor is teaching. That is all code that you will write and has nothing to do with the LMS users database and passwords and hashes and stuff like that.